The scripture this morning is taken from the Psalms. First, Psalm 145, verses 15 through 19, adapted from the Message version. All eyes are on you, O God, expectant. You give them their meals on time. Generous to a fault, you lavish your favor on all creatures. Everything God does is right. The trademark on all God's work is love. God is there, listening for all who pray and mean it. Those who are in awe of God find that God does what's best for them. God hears them call out and saves them. And from Psalm 104, verses 10 through 15, from the New Revised Standard Version. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and plants for people to use, to bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the human heart, oil to make the face shine, and bread to strengthen the human heart. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. May God bless the reading of his word.
Washing away my sins, giving me hope to live again, filling my heart with love, bringing me strength from God above.
Let me add my own word of thanks to our wonderful staff and volunteers and the children and youth who worked so hard this week on the Splash Kingdom Performing Arts Camp. Some of the props from that decorate our chancel today, and you heard two wonderful songs that the kids did. So give our staff and volunteers your thanks for putting in many hours' work this week for our children and our youth. Those of you who have known me a while know of my deep, deep love for vegetables. Well, no, that's a lie, right? You've heard me joke that I would be delighted to take up gardening once someone develops bacon plants or shrimp trees. Despite Melba Mayall's earnest efforts as a former dietitian to convince me of the narrowness of my ways, I have mostly remained an unrepentant sinner, eating salads happily, although I do view salads as simply the carrier of croutons, but continuing to flee the horrors of cooked vegetables. It's kind of a fun, recurrent shtick to proclaim my culinary pickiness from time to time, knowing that you laugh along with me. But this morning, as I have been considering and praying over the Psalms for this day, the latest in our summer sermon series on a road trip through the Psalms, I find that my self-proclaimed disdain for vegetables is not cute or funny, but embarrassing and even a bit shameful. Why? Listen to those words again. All eyes are on you, O God, expectant. You give them their meals on time. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and plants for people to bring forth food for all from the earth. I hear those words this morning knowing that I have never, unless by choice, missed a meal. I have never seriously wondered when I will eat again. If I don't wish to eat, it's not because there's nothing to eat. It's because I have the luxury in the midst of enough food to choose not to eat. I have never known the experience of not being able to feed my children, watching them cry themselves to sleep because their empty bellies hurt so badly. I have never known the gnaw of nighttime pain from not having been able to find any food that day. My disdain for vegetables is only possible because I have never known what it is like to not have enough. I can choose to neglect my vegetables because I enjoy the luxury of always having had alternatives to fill my stomach. But friends, so many of the earth's people do not have that choice, have never known such a luxury, and would cynically sigh in frustration at the psalmist's assertion that God gives everyone their meals right on time. Now, I do not cite these things to make either you or me feel guilty. As I said in an earlier sermon in this series, guilt can sometimes be a very good thing, causing us to know that we have failed to do something we should have done or have done something we shouldn't have done. But the feeling of guilt all by itself is not helpful, especially when we act as if by simply feeling guilty we've done something about the problem when we have not. So, what shall we think about all of this? What should we do? What do the Psalms have to teach us about our opportunities and obligations in this day and age? Well, to begin to answer those questions, let's turn to the context in which the Psalms were composed. Scholars suggest that today's Psalms originated a couple of thousand years ago. The lands that we know as the Middle East were sparsely settled and probably only had a few 100,000 people. Cities were not cities as we know the term, but towns of a few thousand inhabitants. Most folks farmed. The lucky few were also able to keep sheep or goats. Most people would never travel more than 10 miles from where they were born. And the extended family was crucial to being able to literally stay alive. And those ancient Jews had a practice they had observed for generations. Those who farmed never ever harvested every last bit of their crops. No, they always left the edges of the field unharvested so that the poor, the familyless, the widow, and the orphan knew that they could always find grain to harvest or fruit to pluck from those fields' edges. It's a practice that nowadays we call gleaning, and it was a cardinal virtue going back to the dawn of the Jewish people. Now, eating handfuls of ripened grain may not sound like the tastiest of meals, but it did make it possible for those on the margins, those on the edge, to live. What then does all of that from a much different time and context have to do with our day and time? Two things. First, in an era in which the entire Jewish population of a vast territory was less than the population of modern-day Colorado Springs, it was indeed possible. It was possible for family and synagogue to take care of the needs of the poor among them. That is simply no longer the case. We live in a country of 325 million people. Upwards of 20% of folks move each year. A smaller and smaller percentage have extended family near them, and dramatically fewer are part of any faith community. The point, it is simply not possible for church and synagogue and mosque to replace the assistance to the needy from social programs that have come to be necessary in our technological, mobile, non-agrarian economy. The nonpartisan organization Bread for the World estimates that every single faith community, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, in this country would need to give over $700,000 a year for the next 10 years to offset proposed cuts to programs that aid the needy. As economics writer Michael Hiltzik says, quote, "The idea that community or faith-based charities were more efficient, effective, and capable than the government of addressing economic stringency hasn't been true since the Industrial Revolution transformed the U.S. from an agrarian economy to an urban nation of 300 million plus people. And it's certainly not true in comparison to an agricultural society of 2,000 years ago. To suggest that such organizations, he says, can effectively replace social programs is worse than a mere fantasy. It's a cynical and dangerous fantasy. What's the second point to be learned from the situation of those long ago Psalms? Well, I remember one of my mother's sayings that seems apt here. She was the one who, when I was little, did most of the grocery shopping and cooking for the family. I can remember her more than once standing in front of the refrigerator and saying, "Well, I guess the groceries aren't magically going to fly here from the supermarket, are they?" Or at dinner time, "I guess dinner isn't going to cook itself, will it?" She, of course, was right. I never once experienced groceries being teleported from Safeway a la Star Trek style, or a meal that magically appeared on the table without the work of planning and preparing. And the reality that it took my mother's work to get us fed also was indicative of just how many other people made it possible for us to eat. She didn't have to go out into the backyard and slaughter a cow. She didn't have to plant and water and fertilize and harvest the produce. But someone did. Someone did all those things and countless others. The workers who harvested or butchered, the packers who prepared the food for transport, the truckers who got it from farm to store, the grocery clerks who kept the shelves stocked, and on and on and on. And that's then exactly the second point. Getting fed on our journeys is always a partnership. None of us, thank goodness, has had to live like the early American explorer Kit Carson, who wrote in his diary that for 2 years he did not eat anything that he hadn't personally plucked or gathered or killed. We eat because others help feed us. A whole chain of folks, a medley, a melange, a menagerie of folks whom we will never know. It is the same then with God's good gift of food. I'm struck by that line in Psalm 104 where the writer is describing God. Generous to a fault, you lavish your favor on all creatures. The problem is that we humans have not held up our end of the partnership with God. God indeed lavishes food, wants all people to be fed, wants no one to live with the misery of a chronically empty stomach, and has made it possible for there to be enough food. You see, there is enough food on this good earth so that no one should ever have to go hungry. The world produces today 17% more food than it did 30 years ago. But almost 1 billion people still lack enough to eat. The world already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people, yet 1/5 of the world is still hungry. Why? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. In the words of one writer, quote, "Hunger is caused by poverty and inequality, not scarcity." Or from the perspective of the Psalms, our partnership with God has gone awry, gone off the rails, and the food that God lavishes does not reach everyone, therefore. Now, some of that is due to natural disaster. Long-running and horrific drought-caused famine in much of Africa has almost overwhelmed the transportation structures that could get food to these folks. 60% of the world's hungry are women and children. And research shows that in every culture and country, among every religion and value system, reducing the birth rate is the single most important factor in the reduction of poverty and the amelioration of hunger. Where women are repressed and abused and subject to the whims of men, poverty increases, birth rates rise, and hunger goes up. And God's hopes are thwarted. So let's return to where we started. How do we honor the partnership that God has made with us? A partnership that underlies every word in both our Psalms, a partnership that can be seen in the history of the Jewish people when God constantly reminded them that out of their gratitude they had an obligation to help feed the poor. The world is such that it is no longer possible for extended families and faith communities to alone care for those in need, to feed all of the hungry. And so our understanding of how to best partner with God so that the words of the psalm become even more true means that we must address both the symptoms of a partnership gone off the rails, and we must address the causes. We address the symptoms when we host homeless families through IHN, which, as I said, we've just finished doing this week, and when we add to our grocery lists extra purchases for ecumenical social ministries. And make no mistake, symptoms are important. When you have a terrible cold, you may not be able to slay the virus that is causing it, but you can take your NyQuil and you feel human at least. And then there are some simpler things that we can each do that will make a huge difference. In the words of writer Nathaniel Johnson, quote, "We can also be a lot better at sharing our portion of food by eating less, wasting less, and choosing more environmentally responsible meals." Ouch. I think that means that as part of my own partnership with God, I may need to learn to like vegetables. But we can, as a people, as Christians who want our nation, our government to be peopled by men and women driven by true Christian values, we can also insist that the root causes be addressed. We can ask that those who lead us make sure that family planning help is still made available to women worldwide to help spring them from the multi-generational trap of poverty and too much fertility. We can practice responsible carbon stewardship and insist that our leaders take seriously the increasing famine and rising sea levels caused in part by carbon rampant technology. We can insist that food never, ever be used as a weapon of foreign policy, for that would grieve God. Mr. Johnson provocatively puts the point this way, quote, "It does not work," and I agree with him, it does not work for governments to take complete control of food markets, but it's also a bad idea for governments to completely ignore their responsibility for feeding people. Because if left entirely, he says, to market forces, food always flows towards wealth and away from poverty, which leads to famine. Governments, he says, must intervene to prevent hunger. Social safety nets in the form of meals, money, health care, and education really do increase the likelihood that children born into poverty will be able to go to school, and that is the number one predictive factor of whether someone will stay in poverty, is whether they complete high school and make better lives for themselves. To make this possible, he says, there must be safety nets and infrastructure, but also the cutting of bureaucracy and red tape. The title of a hymn we sometimes sing seems an apt summation for this part of our summer's road trip, called as partners in Christ's service. Listen to the words of the final verse. So God grant for us for tomorrow new ways to order human life that surround each person's sorrow with a calm that conquers strife. Make us partners in our living, our compassion to increase. Messengers of faith, thus giving hope and confidence and peace. Will you pray with me? Oh God, show us how to move from guilt to gratitude, and from gratitude to giving. Help us have the courage as individuals to do those things that can help people be fed. Help us as a people, as a nation, to be led by your vision of a world where indeed all are fed, all are loved, all are cherished. May it be so.